Hello and welcome to this week's Food for Thought. Mark Lockridge here, the pastor of New Life Fellowship in Letterkenny and Milford Reformed Presbyterian Church. It's good to have you with us. Just over 83 years ago last week, these famous words echoed out over the airwaves.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
That's President Franklin Roosevelt speaking following the attack on Pearl Harbour by the Japanese Air Force. The attack was launched without warning, with no declaration of war. 353 bombers, torpedo planes and fighters came out of nowhere and wreaked havoc. They killed over 2,300 soldiers and wounded a further 1,100. 18 ships were sunk or run aground, including 5 battleships. I've been reading about the man who orchestrated and led the attack, Mitsuo Fuchida. He described it as the most thrilling exploit of my career. And he had seen action in the Solomon Islands, Java, and the Indian Ocean. He seemed to lead a charmed life, surviving at least 3 crashes, a ship he was on being blown up, and he was in Hiroshima the day before the atomic bomb was dropped, only to receive a call away at the last moment. What fascinates me, though, is not his near escapes from death, but a much greater escape that he had. After the war, Fuchida was disillusioned and bitter. He buried himself in farming and alcohol. He determined to write a book called No More Pearl Harbour, setting out a better way for nations to live. But as he tried to write it, he couldn't find a way to deal with the problem of the human heart. And in the midst of these thoughts, Japanese prisoners of war were returning from America. A friend was amongst them, and he went to meet him to ask simply one question. What question would you ask? Well, here's the one Fuchida asked. How were you treated as a prisoner of war? He knew, of course, how the Japanese had treated the American and British prisoners of war, but he was surprised at the response. How were you treated as a prisoner of war? Well, was the response. His friend spoke of a young Christian woman called Peggy Covell, who had cared for them in the prison camps. When Japanese prisoners of war asked her why she volunteered to help them, her reply was this: because Japanese soldiers killed my parents. Her missionary parents were beheaded by the Japanese, and knowing they prayed before they died, Peggy was convinced that her parents had forgiven them. Could she do less? To Fuchida, this love for one's enemies was utterly inexplicable, and he became obsessed with trying to understand why anyone would treat their enemies with kindness and forgiveness. And one day he was handed a leaflet sharing the story of Jacob de Chazer, a man inspired by Pearl Harbour to enlist in the American Air Force to take revenge, and he ended up a prisoner of the Japanese and was filled with hatred. But one day in prison he started to read the Bible, and it changed him completely. And after the war he returned to Japan and set up a church in one of the cities that he had bombed. De Chazer's story now engrossed Fuchida. How could such hatred be turned to love? Fuchida bought a New Testament, and as he read, he came to Jesus' words, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Things started to make sense to him. Fuchida writes, I was impressed that I was certainly one of those for whom he had prayed. Right at that moment, I seemed to meet Jesus for the first time. I understood the meaning of his death as a substitute for my wickedness. And so in prayer, I requested him to forgive my sins and to change me from a bitter, disillusioned ex-pilot into a well-balanced Christian with purpose in living. Fuchida continues, that date, April the 14th, 1950, became the second day to remember of my life. on that day, I became a new person. It's a fascinating account, isn't it? And I think that many people would like to become a new person. We look at ourselves, perhaps in the dark recesses of the night, and there are things that we wish were different. Things perhaps we wish that we could shake off, or a past that we could undo. And what Fachida experienced, each of us can experience too. The same Jesus that changed him is still changing people today. Or maybe hard and difficult things have happened to you, and you struggle with resentment and anger at what was done, or as Fachida describes it, perhaps bitter and disillusioned. But that freedom and that ability to forgive that Peggy Covell and Jacob de Chazer experienced, you can too. The same Jesus that changed Covell and de Chazer and Fachida and countless others is still changing people today. Thanks for listening. And if you want to find out more, drop me an email, mark@newlifefellowship.ie. Have a great week.